Hi, everyone. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's case study. So I'm really excited to have David Sullivan here. He's a senior advisor at SPARC, which if you're at a school and you're not familiar with SPARC, it's effectively an association for all of the really cool auxiliary folks who are out there generating revenue for independent schools. Highly recommend that you check it out. But before SPARC, David was a head of school for 16 years at Breakwater School, which is in Portland, Maine, and has a really cool story around, when he arrived and the role that auxiliary programs played. And David, I talked to a lot of schools and, revenue is clearly top of mind for many of them. I'm super excited to tell your story because I think you unlocked something that, I don't know, it could be a roadmap for some schools that are out there. So first off, David Sullivan, thank you for taking time today. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. For having me.
Awesome. Hey, listen, before we dig in, we've got a lot to talk about with Breakwater, but tell us a little about yourself, your background, and then a little bit about Breakwater School, if you don't mind.
Sure. I started my career 35 plus years ago, and my first teaching job was teaching at a summer program. It was actually a program based at Wellesley College called Exploration. And I eventually became one of the founding directors of their junior program, which was the program for 4th through 7th graders. But then the rest of my career, I was a faculty member at a bunch of independent schools, Northville, Mount Hermon, Milton Academy. And then I was a public school principal, actually, for 7 years, and then went to Breakwater for 16 years. But I'm like you, I'm really passionate about the whole independent school possibility and did a lot of accreditation work. I served on the commission for independent schools at NEASC and was chair of the commission for a few years. So this is something I'm just really passionate about. And for me, the reason I'm now with SPARC full time is I think my experience at Breakwater has sort of created I don't want to use the word evangelical, but I think it was certainly a lifeline for my little school in Portland, Maine. And I think if we hadn't made the investment, really leaned into auxiliary program, I'm not sure that the school would still be standing now. So, Breakwater is a small co-ed, I would say more in the progressive playbook of schools in Portland, Maine, which is, Maine's biggest city, but it's a, city population of about 60,000. Greater Portland altogether is about 100,000. So it's not a huge place. But and when I got there, it was 2007. I was hired to start July 1st, 2007. And, I could just, if I want me to just keep going, I can, but,
Well, the world changed then, right?
It did. And we were sort of maybe a year ahead of everybody else because, I was the 6th head of school in 7 years at Breakwater. So there was a lot of leadership instability and transition. And, due to that, there were some pretty severe financial problems. I inherited what would have been about a $350,000 deficit on a $2.5 million budget. So one of my first jobs was to try to reduce that kind of a deficit. But we would, then the next year the recession hit, and so we were dealing with a lot of problems that a lot of schools got hit with the following year.
I was going to ask, what were some of the just strategic factors that, attracted you to figuring out this auxiliary revenue path? I mean, was it the fact that you walked in with a $350,000 deficit? Were there other considerations?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I should start by saying that, I had a lot of naive confidence back then, maybe, and sort of this idea that I didn't know I couldn't do it, so I did it sort of thing.
Sure.
There it was really, I think the strategy at first was desperation more than strategy. I had inherited a strategic plan that was based on an increasing school age population and demographic in Maine, which turned out not to be the case. Post 9/11, this happens in Maine all the time. Post 9/11, a lot of people moved out of the cities to come to Maine. So everyone was like, great, demographics are changing, more school age students. And then it dropped off a cliff and didn't really happen. But when the strategic plan was written, there were bold projections of enrollment and, things like that. Also, the recession hit, and that wasn't in the strategic plan. And if anything, it was a lesson for me going forward of be careful with strategic plans, that you don't sort of get stuck to the world doesn't care about your plan, right? And so the world changed. and if we had stuck to the plan that we had. So I guess what I'm saying is I was handed a strategic plan that made 0 sense anymore.
Right.
And things were kind of off the rails financially. So really it just was a matter of just me getting there and just starting to do things. One of the reasons I think I was hired was because of my sort of auxiliary background working with exploration. And I think there was some hope that maybe I could get some traction going with some plans there. But stepping back just a little bit, the school, had some real branding problems. There was a real low morale because of all the changes in leadership. There was some, obviously some real financial problems. It was in a declining school age, demographic kind of city. So there were a lot of these sort of factors where there was just this enormous pressure to get going. And so I think on one hand, I just started to do it. But I think early on, I had all these choices I could make. And the mantra generally, particularly at that time for heads of school, was enrollment and endowment, right? Or fundraise, get more kids in the door. That's what's going to rescue you.
From a revenue point of view.
From a revenue point of view. And so I'm looking around saying, okay, how the heck are we going to get more kids? They just aren't necessarily there in the city. I was in a small community without a great fundraising record. And so, but that was my initial focus because I was like, oh, that's what head of school is supposed to do. And one of my first meetings with one of the school's all-time leading donors, I met with him and I clumsily asked him for money because I was not a great fundraiser at that point. And, he said to me, if you ask me for advice, I'll give you money. And if you ask me for money, I'll give you advice. And then he walked out. And I thought, oh, great, I just blew it.
So he literally, it was like, you made the ask and he gave you that line and then left.
And gone. And what I realized later, we became great friends, but it was a test. He was testing me.
Sure.
And so the next day I called him and I said, I'd love to ask you some advice. And he's like, oh, great. This guy's learning.
You're learning, right? Yeah.
And one of the things he said to me, which was really, I think, just really sort of changed everything for the way I saw my role. And what he said was, look, I could give you $1 million. I have $1 million. And there's probably not many other people in our community that can give you $1 million. And what does that do for you, really? You put it in the endowment, you get $40,000, $50,000 a year draw, maybe. So how many millions are you going to have to raise before that really has a big impact on your budget? But then he said, or I can invest in a business and you could run a business and earn, some net revenue from that business. And then that becomes your living endowment. And that shift in sort of mindset for me was huge. And then I started to realize, as he pointed out, for every $40,000 to $50,000 of net you have, that's like having $1 million in the endowment. Now that was back in 2007. And I know you've seen the same data I have from NBOA, but now auxiliary programs are outperforming annual endowment draws,
right,
as well as, annual fundraising.
Right.
Back then that wasn't necessarily the case, but I think it was very forward thinking for him just to be thinking about that. And so that was the moment where I said, okay, this is where I'm going to focus my attention. Yes, I'll still keep fundraising and we'll still try to, bring in some good numbers for the annual fund. And yes, we're going to, of course, still work on enrollment, but it seemed like there was low hanging fruit for auxiliary and summer programs.
So where did you start?
Oh, well, that's a great question because there was a sort of a in-house aftercare program that served Breakwater students, but it was really viewed more as a service to families. So I think it probably lost money actually. And it was run by a part-time coordinator who would just pretty much show up for the afternoon. She did a great job, but there was no bigger plan. We had sort of a niche, small summer program that was really good quality, really great director running it, but it was, 1 5-week theater arts program for a fairly small number of students. And so, I saw that there was this huge potential for it. And so we immediately started thinking about, okay, how can let's get more than just our own students? Because at that point, the enrollment in the school was about 125 students. So it was very, very small. And having just been a public school principal, I looked around and thought, wow, there's all these public schools here with all these students that have nothing to do after school. Let's go get them. So we didn't have any buses. So I started buying buses and running out to the public schools to bring kids in after school. And that's a whole other sort of conversation because, I found out a lot later that not many independent schools do that. It didn't occur to me not to do it. It was more just like, well, that's where the market is. Let's go get them.
Well, and you had that public school experience too.
I did. And, it's interesting over time when I sort of told that to other heads or auxiliary directors or schools, their reaction is like, oh, our school would never accept that. Like our parents wouldn't accept it, or our head of school wouldn't go for it, or our board wouldn't go for it. And often there's usually a few sort of reasons people bring it up. One is like, oh, we're letting the riffraff into the building. Another one, which I did hear, I didn't hear that so much at Breakwater, but what I did hear sometimes was this sort of misnomer that, oh, wait, so my tuition dollars are supporting all these public school kids after school. And so one thing that I really had to work hard at sort of changing the idea about was, no, actually it's the other way around, that we're actually generating revenue from these students that's actually making the day program better and stronger.
How did you do that? I mean, what were some of the things that you did?
It's just sort of lots of endless conversations, honestly. But and some of it was, I think, I had to do a lot of internal messaging. And first of all, like even taking a step back from that, there were some challenges. Like we didn't have really a designated space for auxiliary. I didn't have a full-time leader. It's very little startup money for these things. So I really had to spend some time with my community, sort of building up the commitment and the excitement and the idea that this is a way forward. And, honestly, at first, I think there was a lot of support and excitement for, this is great. We have this new head here that's like, he's just going to do stuff and this is great. And I had a lot of faculty support. But then what started to happen over time was, like with any growing auxiliary program, it starts to sort of, push at the boundaries. Suddenly there's more stress on facilities. There's, teachers maybe can't stay in their classrooms as long as they did, or maybe they have to do more work to prepare their classroom for the summer, or maybe clean up a little bit after the summer. So there were all these sorts of things that I didn't fully appreciate at first. And then I really had to sort of work on that messaging and really work on constantly building the commitment. One of the things I used to go around and say, at least to the faculty jokingly, until I was told that it really made people nervous, was the success of our auxiliary program is the job security program for everybody, including me. That if this doesn't succeed, there's not a lot of other levers to pull, so this has got to go and I need your cooperation. The other thing I did at one point, because, sometimes like in schools, and I get it, I was a fourth grade classroom teacher, there's a little territorialism with your classrooms, right? And so sometimes I think teachers have this idea that like, it's my classroom. And no, it's not your classroom, it's the school's classroom. So at one point I took all the teachers' names off the doors of the classrooms. And then I said, you can put up signs that talks about the activities that happens in there and who's in there. So you could say, instead of Mrs. Jones's classroom, it's classroom 30 and Mrs. Jones, first grade class during these times, because the aftercare is going to put their sign on there for when it's aftercare time. But this idea that the real estate is the schools and we need to maximize it all the time and everybody's going to be on board with that. And, and honestly, to the credit of the faculty and the community, people embraced it. I mean, it wasn't always smooth. But I think like, and particularly as we got traction and success, and they started to see their paychecks increase a little bit because we had extra money, I think people started to see more and more the potentiality of it.
So I got a whole bunch of questions. I'm going to stick with the faculty for a second. So it almost sounds like you had to open up operationally how the school is run, how the challenges that we're facing. I mean, how much transparency was there and did you offer to faculty?
Yeah, I was pretty transparent, certainly about what my objectives were. And that, at first, like I said, it was all about money. I just was desperate to raise money. Right. Over time, I realized that the return on investment was way broader than just measuring it with money. And I didn't even fully anticipate that at the start. Just sort of a quick aside that this maybe gives a framework. By the time 2015 came around, our youth enrichment programs became so important to not only the fiscal health of the school, but also to our identity as a school. Because we had this sort of public school connection, it really added a dimension of public purpose for our school, and really thinking about how to serve underserved kids in our community, how to be a good citizen of Portland and a good neighbor. And, and that had a lot of ramifications in itself. Like, a lot of goodwill came our way, a lot of great branding, great word of mouth. It made things a lot easier to negotiate with the city because we had a lot of goodwill with the city at that point. We weren't seen as this sort of gated community. We were seen as a community resource. And because of that, one of the things that we did in 2015, which I don't know of any other school that's done this, our nonprofit status was that of the independent school.
Yep.
And we realized that was a problem for us because we started doing a lot of fundraising for our auxiliary programs, scholarships, and different initiatives to raise money to like build out a makerspace, or to do Lego robotics, or to build out these different things. And that was a non-starter for some like corporate donors or some foundations, which is, if you're an independent school, forget it. Like, you can't even apply for a grant. So we reincorporated as a nonprofit still, but we shifted from being a independent school to being a learning center. And we defined the learning center really as three components. One was we had an independent day school. That was one of our programs. Another one of our programs, we had three pillars, let's say, was a youth enrichment program, which included our after-school programs, vacation programs, summer programs. And then a third one, which we were in development of until COVID hit, and then it served was like a parent and professional development kind of arm of things. So we really sort of redefined, and initially that was done, I think, a little bit narrowly, like to just say, oh, let's change the optics of who we are, and maybe we can get some more donors to help us support us. But by doing it, it sort of shifted in a big ways our whole mindset. I mean, it shifted our board. We started to attract more board members who are more community-oriented board members, not necessarily just relating to Breakwater School. We always started to have board members who were connected to our auxiliary program. We had a public school principal as one of our board members. Just people who would never have been on our board, were interested now because we had a broader kind of outreach to our mission and a bigger impact of our mission. And then that also changed a lot for our teachers. We could never pay our teachers great, but I think it added this dimension of, particularly if you're a mission-driven educator, this sense that you were part of some organization that was bigger than just supporting, sort of fairly advantaged population, that we're really a community organization. People felt better about, I think, working for Breakwater and at Breakwater, and it really sort of became part of our identity. And then there were all these fallout things that we didn't realize, like I couldn't call myself a head of school anymore because I wasn't a school. It was a learning center, right? So I became an executive director. So titles had to change. We had to change our website. We had to change my email couldn't be at breakwaterschool.org, right? It had to be breakwaterlearning.org.
Interesting.
There are all these kinds of shifts that we had to do. But by doing that, it really sort of changed, I think, the whole identity of our organization. And it really elevated auxiliary and summer programs.
Before you got to that point, because that was, what year was that you reincorporated?
That was 2015.
Okay, so that's 8 years after you arrived. As you were building out those auxiliary programs, like how did you make sure that they were rooted in mission? Like I'm curious about that.
That's a good question. And one, because there was a lot of work to do more, some broadly at Breakwater, we really clarified our mission early on because when I got there, the mission statement, I think, was 2.5 pages long, which made it very difficult as a leader to be like,
wait, did you say 2.5 pages?
2.5 pages long.
Wow.
And so we reduced it to just a couple sentences. And then we worked really hard on defining with a lot of clarity, like what is our approach to education, and developed sort of an educational model and a sort of a learning model. And then we applied that learning model to all of our programs. So whether it was a summer program, an auxiliary program, a math class during the day program, everybody sort of applied this educational model to it. And so that definitely created a little integration to it. And obviously the response, like if you're an academic program of the day, how you interpret that model is different than, say, a summer program. But that was all okay because it was all based in this
right.
model. So that was one thing. Another thing was really integrating the auxiliary staff. Like at Breakwater, they weren't second-class citizens. They came to faculty meetings and professional development, and the director of auxiliary sat on my leadership team so that they were included in all the major decisions. They heard all the same professional development that everybody else did, which was good for kids too, because we tried to work really hard on having some consistency between the day program and after school. Because if you're, a 5-year-old, the rules on the playground should be similar after 3:00
Right.
than they were during
Right.
the day.
Right.
The other thing that helped us a lot too, and this I know doesn't work for all schools, but as a small school, one of the challenges, I know a lot of heads have this challenge, was the success of auxiliary helped us stabilize our faculty, and did that in a few ways. One was it gave more compensation opportunities for faculty so they could earn some more money.
Sure.
The other thing it did is, as a small school, we had a lot of part-time teachers, especially what we call the specialists: art, music, science, some of those, Spanish. So what we were able to do is offer those folks full-time jobs with benefits, and they would teach for a certain number of afternoons in the after-school enrichment classes. And so that continuity also helped a lot. So, we'd have a decent chunk of teachers who would be in the day program and in the auxiliary programs. So they would sort of bring a certain level of quality and consistency as well.
When you were quantifying the financial impact as you were getting deeper and deeper into this, like, what were you seeing?
Yeah, well, the first year we lost money. I can't remember exactly how much, but
Right.
And by the way, that took a shift. I could see it, but not all. Schools are conservative in the sense of and I get this as a head of school, right? You're approached all the time, or a CFO, for, I want another teaching assistant, or we need this other position, or we need, and I used to go in my mind, and I think a lot of heads or principals do, which is, that's just another boat anchor on my budget, right? That's just going to destroy my bottom line. How am I going to make up that difference? And I think that you have to think about auxiliary summer a little differently. That adding a position in auxiliary summer, my question wasn't how bad on the budget is this going to be. My question was, how good is this going to help the budget?
A revenue generator. Right?
Yeah, a revenue generator. And
yeah.
So we had to make investments in it. And so the early couple of years, and we made some investments in spaces, we made some investment in personnel. So the first couple of years, it wasn't, we lost money, and then I think it was year 2 that we broke even. But then we had about 20% growth, at least 20% for over a decade, I think.
Wow.
To the point where the contribution to the gross bottom line at Breakwater was about 3%, less than 3% when I started, and now it's up to about 25%. So it became a significant financial driver. And granted, my school, Breakwater, is a small school, so it's a rounding error for some big schools in terms of budget. But our budget grew from about $2.5 million to $4.5 million over the 16 years, and with that extra living endowment every year, eventually we were able to get out of deficit spending, got into positive budgets, populated a fully funded facilities plant reserve, and then started to also build up the endowment. So, so it drove all the economic change for the school. And the other things too, that the side effects of having the auxiliary, which I didn't fully appreciate at first, again, the enrollment of the school went from about 125 to, right before COVID, like 175. And some of that had to do with the increased visibility in the community and the goodwill that we had in the city of Portland. People thought of us very favorably. And so we were able to convert a lot of students who, would come from the public schools, experience our after school program. Right. Maybe they'd have the Spanish teacher for a class that they loved him and was like, wow, this is what the teachers are like at your school. And so we were able to convert a decent percentage of students to become full-time day students.
Well, because you were, imagine, like, you were intentional about what you rooted both the day program and the auxiliary programs in this educational philosophy, right? Like that, it would was it easy for them to have this experience on the after school side and say, oh, like that may be what it's like day to day if I were to be here? I'm just thinking out loud here.
Yeah. Well, and the other piece too is that because we intentionally, we have this expression at Breakwater called the Breakwater Way. And so even building the after school culture and the summer cultures, we really wanted those cultures to be the Breakwater Way, so we created these really safe environments where where kids felt great about who they were and wanted to participate. And for some, unfortunately, it was very different than their experience in the public school during the day. So for some, even that alone was, I feel different in this place. I feel better. I have better friends. And I think that was another piece to it too.
So like, obviously you're committed to auxiliary programs, right? It's what you do now on the day to day. Like, what do you see, like, how do you see the role of auxiliary programs expanding, given, look, I talk a lot about the pressures on the business model, right? So like, we know that they're established. People, I think, have all agreed that they're causing downward pressure. Like, how do you think auxiliary programs will be one of the solutions that schools can turn to?
Yeah, well, yeah, and I'll be careful not to say it's the solution, but I think, and I wrote a piece about this idea that I think auxiliary programs, I think the awareness of the potentiality of auxiliary programs is growing, but I still think it's a really underutilized lever. And I think that on many, many levels. And so, I kind of think of auxiliary as a potential sort of Swiss Army knife for heads of school. And instead of thinking of it as like, oh, this is like this little side project that we have going and I don't really even know much about it. And I actually had a head of school once tell me that the auxiliary programs at his school were essentially a black box to him. He's like, I don't understand what goes on there. And I was like, wow, you're losing a lot of leverage and opportunities. But, because even for, my little story, between the other returns on investment other than money, there was it helped us retain staff, attract staff. We could offer better packages. We got the more I feel like the relationships between admissions and auxiliary was really important. Also advancement and auxiliary. So I had many, many times when if I could connect a major gift like ask to something that would also benefit auxiliary, it gave a donor one more reason to give. So just a perfect example. I had a major donor who was really interested in supporting our makerspace. They had a grandchild in the day school. And, I said, look, a generous gift. I really appreciate it. But, about 3 times that gift. And I can really invest in this makerspace. But over time, I can make money from it. And I can also serve kids who might not have access to a space like this. And then that became an easier sell. And especially with a donor that, for a lot of donors get a little cagey about like, wait a minute, so you're coming to me for a gift this year, and then it'll be next year and next year and next year. It'll be the same amount of money or more. And like, what are you doing to change your ways so that you're not just dependent on me to pay your bills, right?
Right.
And so when the language for a lot of the donors I had were business types or had business backgrounds and were business savvy. And so when I said, I'm asking for investment in a business so that I can earn my own keep. And then sometimes I would get it, like even a descaling gift over 3 years. And then after the 3 years up, I'd go to them and say, that was successful. I have another idea for another business venture. Are you in? And they're like, yeah, I'm in. And so, there's so many connections. Or how many capital projects get down to they're digging dirt out of the ground and they never checked in with the auxiliary programs, right? I worked with a school once that said, if we had just made the gym 20 feet bigger, we could have split the gym in half and doubled our sports programming in the summer. It was like hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? But nobody checked with them. Nobody asked. So I'm big into like, don't overlook auxiliary and look at all those sorts of angles. The other thing is I have my own sort of pet theory that auxiliary programs are like a canary in a coal mine for a lot of schools, because as your auxiliary programs grow, they're going to bump up against all the weaknesses in your school. Communication, because auxiliary touches everything: facilities, food service, dorms if you have them, athletics, academics. It hits everything. The auxiliary director from their seat, they're going to see all the problems with the school and they're going to deal with them every day. And so often the health of auxiliary, from my perspective, if you have a really healthy auxiliary program, it probably means that the rest of your school is functioning in a healthy way. If it's not functioning in a healthy way, really look at that, because there's probably communication problems, operational problems, system failures, miscommunications. I mean, it's really kind of interesting that way. So I think there's a huge and the demand is there. That's the other thing too, is that summer programs and enrichment programming for kids it's not going away.
Right. Such a good point. And I guess, my last question, David, is if a school, like, imagine somebody's watching or listening to this and they're like, I got to talk to David. I'm super curious about auxiliary programs. Maybe it's 3% of our revenue, right? And I'm inspired. I think we can build that out. If they were to call you and say, where do I get started? Like, what advice would you offer?
Well, I think the first is really getting some clarity on your strategic priorities. Sort of why do you want to do this? What are you trying to accomplish with it?
Right.
I think that's number one. And then because what falls from that, is it all about making money? Is it about supporting your faculty? Is it about increasing the diversity of your student body? Is it for admissions? Because sometimes those things may be contradictory. Maybe it's to be a service for your families, and that's the most important reason, which is contradictory probably to increasing revenue. So just a lot of clarity, I think, first step. Another thing I think is just really being prepared to invest in leadership. I think it makes a big difference to, for a lot of auxiliary directors, they're running programs that are as big as the day program in many cases, if not bigger. Sometimes you have summer directors who run summer programming with more staff and more students on campus than the school year. So, invest in the leadership. And I think as senior leaders, commit to it. You're going to have to do a lot of clearing pathways for your auxiliary programs and dealing with culture and in problems. And like I was saying too, that as you become successful, it is going to put pressure on the system and there's going to be some problems. But just know that that's a natural. If that's happening, it's great because it means your auxiliary programs are growing.
Right.
But just be prepared for that.
Like more wear and tear on the campus, things like that.
Yeah. And it may necessitate like sort of innovations on all kinds of levels, right? Like even at Breakwater, because we were trying to maximize our summer program revenue, but that gave the facilities department way less time to prepare the school for post-summer. So it meant that we had to rethink, how do we do a deep cleaning for the school? And so a lot of it was staged out so that a big chunk of it was done over Thanksgiving break. Another big chunk of it was done, so instead of thinking about it as, we have August to get the campus ready, it became more of a perennial sort of situation where we just tried to, but it meant we had to rethink it, right? That we couldn't do business as usual in the same way.
I love that initial advice too about like, what's the why behind an auxiliary program? Like instead of trying to just throw a solution at a problem, really understanding what the problem is.
Yeah.
All right. Well, David Sullivan, Senior Advisor at SPARC, former head of school at Breakwater School in Portland, Maine, and clearly somebody who has had a lot of success growing auxiliary programs. Thank you for sharing. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Peter. I really appreciate you hearing me out and appreciate all the work you're doing for schools.
Thanks. Well, I think this is going to fold right in nicely. I mean, this is one of those areas where I think schools have lots of potential. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. Well, great. Thanks, Peter.
Got it.